Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 4 in Australian social policy. So this week we are mostly focusing on policy analysis, and we shall be drawing on what is the problem represented to be, or the WPR approach of Carol Bucky. So you might wonder why we decided to focus on this specific approach and not the other approaches which you might see in different textbooks of social policy. So many different reasons really to that. One of the reasons is that this approach is quite relevant to the Australian context. Carol Bucky herself, who, suggested this approach to policy analysis, is Australian. She has worked with the University of Adelaide in South Australia, and I think you can see Carol Bucky's picture on this very first slide of this mini lecture. So, and I've also suggested some useful resources from Carol Bucky, which you will find on the Blackboard site. Really encourage you to start embracing this learning opportunity because it will be very useful, not only for your learning outcomes, but even for our second assessment in this course. And that's another very good reason why we really want to rely on this approach, because it is the approach we are using in our second assessment in the course. You'll be required to draw on 3 questions from this approach as you do your second assessment piece in the course. So again, another very good reason to focus on this. Yeah, I think another good reason really to focus on the WPR approach in this lecture is because it is less prescriptive. It is quite, an elicitive approach to analyzing and understanding policy. In a sense, it doesn't teach you how to analyze policy. It rather gives you just the tools which will help you then become more critical about the way you understand and approach policies. So in a sense, it's such a useful approach to draw on because also it's quite interdisciplinary. And there are many other reasons really why you might want to read more and, embrace this learning opportunity about this specific approach to policy analysis. Now, in this mini lecture, we shall try to revise and deepen our understanding of discourse and the role it plays in policy practice. We shall also try to explain how social policies frame issues as certain types of problems. And we shall try to outline Bucky's WPR approach to policy analysis and even use examples of how different questions from this approach can be applied in real life policy practice. So, Bucky's WPR approach draws really on an interpretive approach to policy analysis. If you can think back to week 2 when we spoke about 3 different approaches to policy analysis, we mentioned the rational approach to policy analysis. We also mentioned the critical approach, and we spoke about the interpretive approach. Now, in this week's content, we shall be mostly drawing on the interpretive approach to policy analysis. And if you can recall what we said that this approach views policy as the result of the way people make sense of the world around them. So this approach really starts from the assumption that the world is socially constructed, and that's at odds from the 2 other previous approaches, which we also spoke about in details. So I would even encourage you at this point, if you can't recall anything about these 3 approaches, to go back to your content from week 2 and try to update your knowledge on these approaches, and that will be very useful for you. So the interpretive approach really starts from the premise that knowledge is acquired through the interpretation and is dependent on people's social context. So rather than perceiving knowledge as something which is out there and which is fixed, we get to prioritize the idea that knowledge is subjective and it is socially constructed, and it is something which is acquired based on people's context. That is who they are, where they live, what their experiences are like. And that in itself gets to shape what people are more likely to see as problems and which problems are not likely to be perceived as such by certain groups of people. Now, this is also very important because it reminds us the key role and the importance of things like time and place and the role these play in how we understand and frame policies. You will recall from the content from week 1, we tried to say that policy is dynamic, it keeps changing over time, but also keeps changing depending on where you are. And you will see very much that there are problems which we see as problems today, but which we probably might have not been perceiving that way maybe a few decades ago. You can think, for example, of corporal punishment of children, which to some extent maybe, in the 1950s were tolerated, but currently that's already a problem. It's no longer tolerated. You can think also of other many issues, and I suggested a Padlet here. I really encourage you to go back to that Padlet and drop an idea there of, which problems you see are being perceived today in a different way from the way they were perceived a few decades ago. You can think, for example, of things like how we now perceive LGBTQ related rights, which are now becoming more and more, a question of equality and human rights and, having clear policies about that in the Australian society today. Whereas if you go back a few decades ago, you'll see that that was not the case. Even here in Australia, there used to be that time where that issue was perceived differently from the way it's perceived today. But even if you go in terms of place, you'll see that even though in Australia we have had these advances in the way we look at LGBTQ plus rights, that's not probably the case in many other parts of the world. There are still global south countries like Uganda, where the issue of LGBTQI being just homosexual is quite criminalized in that context. And, just to give you really an idea on the importance of time and place when it comes to policy analysis and how our subjective understandings, depending on who we are and where we come from, get to influence all those. And this also gets to shape the language and the discourse we adopt when speaking about policies. And as such, of course, language and discourse around all these matters, you can see how it has shifted. The way we spoke about child abuse and neglect in the 1970s is no longer probably the same way we speak about those issues even today. So I'll speak more about this as we move on in this lecture, but just really to give you a flavor on, what we are talking about when we are thinking of Carol Bakke's WPR approach. And of course, just a few reminders regarding the idea of discourse and even language, which we spoke about, which are also socially produced forms of knowledge. And this in itself really refers to the way we make meanings of and construct our world through the language we use in our everyday life. And that language itself is very important. It is very powerful. There is a lot of power in the language we use because how we speak about a problem tells more about how we get to address that problem. That's a very good idea really for you to retain. But another very important idea is around this power, which we find in language, we get to frame certain problems as specific types of problems. And I think I'll speak more to that as we move on to speak to the WPR approach. So in a sense, language is not neutral. It gets to influence the choices we make, but also the assumptions, beliefs, and values underpinning the positions we get to take on different social policy problems. And this really very much problematizes the notion of power, which we also spoke about in week 2. And you'll recall that we said that power is not all about coercion, but it is exercised through dominant knowledge claims. And I think, we tried to speak about Michel Foucault, who very much speaks about this knowledge of these questions of knowledge, power, and discourse. And that dominant discourses reflect the values of powerful groups and are often unquestioned. And that gets in itself to shape what people in the society are likely to see as problems and what they are likely to neglect, even if they might be problems of other people. And I'm also thinking here about how, influential people in the society or people with power might get their problems being on the policy agenda, but not maybe the problems of the marginalized groups in the society. A clear example of this, you'll see that in some societies, how rich people and their problem end up becoming sometimes the problems of everyone else. Even if other people have their own priorities, you find that these people with, power get to be the ones influencing what can get on the policy agenda and what can be neglected. So the idea of discourse is really very important. We spoke about it a little bit in week 2, but just really a few other reminders before we move on to speak about the WPR. And I suggested this illustration of a tree, and hopefully that will help you understand a little bit how discourse operates and the importance it carries when it comes to, discussing policies and analyzing policies broadly. So what I'm trying to say here is that sometimes we tend to focus on, the words people are using, and even the things we think and say, which sometimes might just be a reflection of the language we use, but we get to forget about what are the underlying assumptions behind the language we end up choosing. So language is not neutral, as I said, but language is not also just something which comes at random. Behind a certain language, there are always beliefs, there are always values, and there are assumptions underpinning that language. And to understand, what people really mean about, a certain issue, maybe the way people speak about poverty and how people get to prioritize certain discourses regarding poverty over other discourses, we need to go back, in these core assumptions, values, and beliefs to get a sense of, what people really mean exactly, because that tells us more on what they might end up doing in addressing those problems. If we can think of a specific problem like unemployment and unemployment benefit in particular, we can see clear discourses in the media, people using words like taxpayer versus welfare recipients, hard worker versus dull bludgers, independent versus dependent, lifter, meaning the one who does all the hard work versus leaner, deserving and undeserving. And clearly this creates a certain sort of binary in the way we speak about all these. And the key message or the key assumptions underlying, these binaries is that people should work and be responsible for themselves instead of always depending on the government, and people should contribute to society through hard work. And this clearly divides the society into these two separate categories. On the right side, where you have everything you don't want to be, but on the other side where you have, all the other good discourses. So clearly you can see the power which we find in discourse, and which tells us and reminds us that the way we speak about social problems is in itself a social construction, and that social construction gets to influence, the way we are likely to perceive certain problems and how we are likely to address them. And you can think of many other examples. An example, for example, we considered in week 1, on the comedy video on where is Australia's largest suburb. So you can recall how language was being used in that video, and that will be helpful again for you to understand the important role of discourse in understanding policies and analyzing them. Thank you very much, and see you in the next recording.